Years ago, a local child murderer is let loose on a technicality only to die at the hands of a group of rightfully furious parents. But just when the parents and children of Springwood, Ohio think their nightmare is over for good, Fred Krueger returns from the grave to finish the job he started. I'm Cinematico Magnifico of amoralcrackpot.com, and on this episode of The Nightly Chill, we're taking a look at the 2010 remake of A Nightmare on Elm Street, directed by Samuel Bayer. While the setup, concept, and general plot of the original remains largely unchanged, there are a number of alterations made to the details. For many, the most immediate might be how Jackie Earle Haley replaced Robert Englund in the role of Freddy. But beyond this and the equally notable visual changes to that character, there's also a somewhat expanded background. Not only do we see Freddy's death depicted on screen this time around, something that was only ever previously done in the pilot episode of Freddy's Nightmares, an anthology TV show based on the film series, and Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare, the misleadingly named 6th entry in the franchise. But we learn that Fred Krueger was also the janitor of a local preschool, and it's here where the still living Krueger met, tortured, and killed his young victims. This seemingly minor expansion proves more significant in that it provides a motivation for Freddy targeting teens rather than young children, something that was left a bit more ambiguous in the 1984 original. He has a personal connection and obsession with these particular children, memories of which they've long suppressed but are unknowingly still suffering from over a decade later. This continued fear of Fred Krueger is what quite literally allowed Freddy to live on in the nightmares of his surviving victims until he's somehow grown strong enough to eventually physically harm them. But while this change adds some much needed nuance to the story, the rest of the movie largely suffers from needless alterations that only serve to keep this from being a simple beat-for-beat remake. Several characters are renamed but otherwise fill the exact same roles as their 1984 counterparts. Key scenes are rearranged and altered in a way that speeds things along at the expense of telling an engaging story. Though, ironically enough, the first act drags on and on, whereas the original managed much more in far less time. But the two greatest sins this remake commits is in how any character not Fred Krueger falls flat, and the utter lack of tension and dread. Wes Craven's 1984 original teased Fred Krueger throughout its first act, with our leads growing increasingly afraid and aware that there was a very real threat waiting for them in their sleep. This allowed the movie to focus on these characters, their relationships with each other and the world around them, and always an ever-worsening feeling that things could go horribly wrong at any moment. The 2010 version, meanwhile, showcases Freddy from the outset. He's a known entity and threat from start to finish. There's no mystery for the audience or the characters. Instead, we simply watch these characters, all of whom are so horribly miscast with actors who come across as heavily medicated throughout, but these characters simply drift from one scene to the next until the movie finally comes to an end. No tension, no anxiety, and certainly no drama. Admittedly, there are a couple of interesting death scenes that feel fresh and somewhat creative, but they're often lost in a sea of laughably bad special effects that are easily the worst in the franchise's history. And yes, I am including Freddy's Nightmares in that comparison. While this movie's new contribution to the story of Fred Krueger, this personification of the sort of trauma young victims of assault and violence might actually experience, is indeed interesting, but Bayer never really capitalizes on it. In the end, A Nightmare on Elm Street 2010 is just so poorly executed that it easily embodies why modern remakes fail to sit well with critics and audiences. It's lazy, poorly acted, and somehow has worse visuals than the 25-year-old original. Remakes should be taken as an opportunity to expand and explore new grounds while keeping to the spirit of the original. What they shouldn't be is a regressive giant step backwards. You can follow Amoral Crackpot on Facebook and Twitter, and also be sure to leave any questions, comments, and suggestions for future reviews in the comments section below, and maybe discuss today's movie at greater length. Tomorrow night, we'll be taking a look at arguably the most controversial and divisive remake of a beloved horror franchise, Rob Zombie's 2007 reimagining of Halloween. But until then, I'm gonna make like a tree and get out of here.